when I speak to my students about one of the ideas that matters most to them, which is the idea of kind of rights. Like when we talk about rights and human rights, nothing seems to get my students more excited, as it were. But then when I ask them, well, what do you know about the history? Like, where did this idea come from? Where did rights come from? It's not something that has always... They actually know absolutely nothing about this kind of history. And one of the reasons why I sort of use ignorance as like the second kind of characteristic of these kind of attitudes towards the past in the ahistoric age is that, wow, I mean, that really struck me. It revealed that what characterizes our culture today is that we actually know very little even about the ideas that we tend to value. We don't even think that we need really to know their history.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable.
Sarah, in your wonderful new book that's not quite out yet, but it's coming out soon, Priests of History, you suggest that we are living in an ahistoric age. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is the idea that we live in a moment now in which I think we've completely disconnected. I mean, this in sort of contemporary Western world. We have disconnected ourselves from the past in the sense that we don't really know how to engage well with history. And we're kind of living in a culture too, in which we think that the past is that history is profoundly kind of irrelevant to what life is all about. And moreover, when we do engage with history, we tend to do so in a really impoverished manner, in which we kind of reduce history to what ends up being kind of culture wars.
Sarah, what are some of the key characteristics of living in this ahistoric age?
Well, I think there are kind of three attitudes that we tend to have as a culture now towards the past. Irrelevance, ignorance, and ideology, to kind of sum it up. So when I say irrelevance, what I mean is that the kind of understanding of what life is all about in the West today is that life is all about kind of self-fulfillment and self-gratification, inventing ourselves. And for that reason, the past seems to be irrelevant. So for example, when I ask my undergraduate students to tell me what they think life is all about, like how would they describe, even not their own personal views so much as what do you think our culture tells us about what is a good life? What is life all about? And they basically say, finding and then being my true self. So, but in that kind of idea that life is about kind of self-invention and fulfillment, there is no place for the past. There's no place for history. Not least because we don't think of ourselves as being kind of historical subjects. We think of ourselves as kind of inventing ourselves. So there's a kind of sense in which history broadly is kind of deemed irrelevant to the kind of project of modern culture, which is all about the self. The second one is ignorance. And really, ignorance is pretty self-explanatory, but I think that we are today ignorant of the past in a way in which in previous generations was simply not the case, or at least not to nearly the same degree. So for example, if you look at the number of enrollments in history at undergraduate college level courses, history is not something which is kind of valued as being part of the ways of equipping citizens to actually participate in society. It's not considered important that we actually know much about history or how to engage with it. And I think one sort of example that I think really epitomizes that kind of ignorance is that when I speak to my students about one of the ideas that matters most to them, which is the idea of kind of rights, like when we talk about rights and human rights, nothing seems to get my students more excited, as it were. But then when I ask them, well, what do you know about the history? Like, where did this idea come from? Where did rights come from? It's not something that has always... They actually know absolutely nothing about this kind of history. And one of the reasons why I sort of use ignorance as like the second kind of characteristic of these kind of attitudes towards the past in the ahistoric age is that, wow, I mean, that really struck me. It revealed that what characterizes our culture today is that we actually know very little even about the ideas that we tend to value. We don't even think that we need really to know their history. And the third kind of characteristic is ideology. And what I mean by that is that when we tend to encounter the past, I mean, if you look, for example, at the way that history is spoken about in the public sphere, in the media and so forth, really the moments in which we actually discuss history, they're not healthy conversations anymore. There's this phenomenon of the culture wars, and there's a kind of way in which there's discussion about history which has kind of deteriorated into culture wars now, in a way that, although of course there have always been arguments about history, there's a kind of degree to which the culture wars have kind of enmeshed history in their talons, in which has never really happened in a previous kind of generation.
This is a massive question, but how can history and learning about history in an appropriate way help us with the culture wars, would you say?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think when you actually study history carefully, what you can actually glean from it is the fact that even through a contemporary ethical or moral lens, there is a kind of complexity to the past, which when we engage with it well is something that we can't actually dismiss. And so when we are able to kind of engage with history and learn about the ethical complexities of the past, the fact that there are, for example, in the same historical person or historical episode, both kind of profoundly problematic attitudes, for example, and yet also good, there is a way in which, if we can understand that well, it can actually help us to engage with the culture wars now, because we're able to engage with complexity. Because at their heart, culture wars are all about is basically reducing complexity into sort of good and evil. It's basically a kind of moral war. So here's an example of this. In the 17th century, one of the philosophers in England, Francis Bacon, one of England's most famous philosophers, makes enormous kind of contributions to natural philosophy. And yet when it comes to the very sort of nascent English colonial project at the time, has some really kind of complex attitudes. And he actually writes an essay called On Plantations, in which he argues, interestingly enough, that he likes a plantation in a pure soil. I'm sort of quoting him here. I like a plantation in a pure soil where people are not displanted to the end to plant in others. So what he means by that is a plantation is a synonym for colony. And what he means by this is that Bacon, on the one hand, is in favour of colonies, and yet, on the other hand, has these kind of misgivings about the way in which English colonialism, particularly in Ireland, actually had been conducted. So he doesn't want a colony, for example, or a plantation to be established where there are people who would be driven off their land or displanted, as he puts it, because of the actual colony. And so anyway, I'm sort of summarising a complex kind of historical moment here and Bacon's thought. But when you engage really well, for example, with that kind of episode, and you're able to realize that on the one hand, there are these, here is Bacon, who is an advocate for English colonization. And yet, on the other hand, here are the misgivings that he has about, and here are the kind of limitations of his ideas. And you recognize the kind of, that this cannot actually be reduced into black or white. It equips us, I think, to then take that kind of knowledge and think about how we engage in contemporary discussions about history, where we're so, it is so tempting and so easy to kind of fall into a kind of very superficial black and white situation.
How do you think we have ended up in this ahistoric age? Why have we got here?
Yeah, this is really interesting. In the book, I kind of explore this in the first a couple of chapters. But I guess the sort of summarized version would be that this is a kind of moment in a sort of late modernity, as it were, in which there have been, as obviously scholars and philosophers have recognized for generations, there's a kind of, in the late modern world, there's a kind of sense in which there are no longer any large stories, any kind of meta narratives, and for various reasons. What I'm kind of pointing out is that one of the effects of this moment in late modernity, I think in no small part accelerated by the effects of the global economy, and also in particular, actually, social media, which is a phenomenon that really only dates in terms of its widespread acceptance for the last 10 years. There is a way in which this kind of moment in late modernity has led to a kind of profoundly kind of ahistoric turn, in which not only are there no longer kind of any large stories that we tell about ourselves, but even in terms of history, there is no longer any sense. So that's sort of the dominant attitude in which we can even make sense of the past, in which the past really is of any use to us now for all kinds of reasons. But I think it's really accelerated in the last 10 years. I think it's a new kind of moment.
Sarah, you mentioned a lack of meta-narrative there. I mean, why do you think we have lost sight of any bigger story? And why is that really significant? What's the impact of not having a bigger story?
Yeah, so this is interesting. I mean, historians and philosophers have spoken about this as a kind of phenomenon, actually, of modernity as well, and of late modernity for a number of years. But really, one of the impact is that if there's no longer any kind of shared story, there's no longer of which we are a part, and there's no longer any kind of shared language of discussion of moral questions, if you like, in the public sphere, then we're all kind of free, as it were, to create our own narratives, our own stories. But this has a profoundly kind of destabilizing effect on public life and on who we think and the way that we think about ourselves and the way that we think about any kind of collective identity, whether it's the nation or whether it's a historical people or whether it's the church and so forth. And so, yeah, the fundamental thing, the fundamental kind of effect is that everything is relativized and kind of radically, to sort of simplify all this, but everything is kind of radically kind of relativized and also really individualized, because once you lose a kind of shared story, you lose the shared concepts and the shared kind of moral language, if you like, through which you actually have discussions with one another.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable. For more shows, resources and our newsletter, visit premierunbelievable.com.